Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee, and then he goes about, and it skips right into his ministry. In Mark, it says, now after that John was put in prison, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and he begins his ministry. In Luke, I remember it was mentioned earlier, basically saying eventually he was put in prison for these reasons, but it doesn't mention when. It just continues saying, Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and there went out a fame of him through all the region round about. Taught in the synagogues, came to Nazareth. They almost throw him off a cliff, but he miraculously walks through the crowd. I think he turned invisible, or he just made it so that everyone was super distracted and looked the other way. In John, however, it says something quite different. It says that right after this is when John the Baptist was looking at Jesus and said, behold the Lamb of God. 2 disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned, asked them what they seek. They're saying, where does he dwell? He says, come and see. Then Andrew goes to get Peter. He renames Peter. So it's really a question between Luke and John, I guess. Does he begin his preaching where they almost throw him off a cliff, or does he begin by meeting Andrew and possibly John the Apostle? I've gotten to the point of John's testimony to the Pharisees and the Jews and the Levites when they come to question him, to interrogate him whether or not he was the Messiah. He responds, he gives his answers, and then after that, starting in John 1:29, it says, the next day John sees Jesus coming to him and says, behold the Lamb which takes away the sin of the world. He gives a short speech to his own disciples, and then he reiterates Jesus being baptized. And then again it says, in 35, it says again, the next day after John stood and 2 of his disciples, he looked upon Jesus as he walked and says, behold the Lamb of God. And that's when 2 of his disciples heard him and they followed Jesus. I'm inclined to believe that these 2 mentions of the next day were the same day. That this first mention saying the next day, okay, Jesus was in his temptation and John the Baptist was being interrogated by the Pharisees. And then the next day, Jesus comes back to him, to the area where he's at, and John the Baptist is explaining to his disciples again, that's him. And then that same moment in verse 35, when it says, again the next day after John stood, 2 of his disciples, and looking upon Jesus, he walked, he says, behold the Lamb of God, and 2 disciples heard him and speak, and they followed Jesus. I feel like that's the same day. Jesus came to him, John the Baptist is explaining to all his disciples, and in that moment, that's when the 2 disciples are like, okay, I understand, and they go with him, and they follow him. And in verse 35, when it says again that the next day, I thought it meant again the next day, meaning the next day after what happened before. So it's not necessarily saying John the Baptist was questioned, the next day, Jesus comes and John the Baptist is speaking about him, and then the next day after that, Jesus is walking by, and then his 2 disciples follow him. However, that's not how Michael Rood sees it. He sees it as 3 different days. Another reason why I thought these might have been the same day is because just after that, in verse 43, it says the day following, Jesus would go forth into Galilee and finds Philip and says to him, follow me. So that would be, as I understood it, the second day after his return. The first day is when John is mentioning the next day, verses 29 and verses 35, and all that John the Baptist is saying is happening that day. And then that second day is verse 43 and on. The day following, Jesus would go into Galilee, he finds Philip. At the beginning of chapter 2, it says the third day they were at a marriage in Cana of Galilee. So it would be the questioning, the next day, which would be the first day after Jesus came back. The day after that, Jesus goes into Galilee to get Philip. And then the third day, they're in Cana of Galilee at the marriage. However, Michael Rood's explanation is that the third day is actually the third day of the week, and that's why they said the third day. That's not the third day in that series. How does it go? I'll just read it to you. John 2:1. The third day is Yom Shlishi, the third day of the week. It takes nearly a day to get from Bethsaida to Cana. So they probably left early in the morning and arrived in time for the wedding festivities that evening. He's from this area, so the distance it takes to get there, I'm inclined to just go with that. Because I could be wrong and he's so insistent of it, I'll just go with it. It's less reorganizing, it's less of a redo of what's already written, so it seems fine to go with that, even though it might be a little unclear. It really does look like it's the same day, but I'm fine with it. So I'll just put it all as it was. And this is the record of John. When the Jews sent priests and Levites to Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" he confessed and denied not, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they which were sent were of the Pharisees. And they asked him and said to him, "Why baptize you then, if you not be that Christ, nor Elijah, neither that prophet?" John answered them, saying, "I baptize with water, but there stands one among you, whom you know not. He it is, who coming after me is preferred before me, whose shoes latchet I am not worthy to unloose." And again, because this is all him giving his testimony to the Levites during their interrogation of him, this is not the same event that I was speaking of earlier, just before he baptized Jesus. This is after. So I'm not going to combine this with the records in the other Gospels. Continuing on, I believe this is 28. These things were done in Bethbara, beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. So after 28, where John was baptizing, 29, the next day, John sees Jesus coming to him and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, which takes away the sin of the world." And John bore record, saying, "I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it abode upon him. And I saw and bore record that this is the Son of God." Okay, I end the paragraph there, 34. I noticed that John 1:15-18 I didn't actually include. I don't know why. I just started at, "and this is the record of John." Maybe it was because there's such a large gap between the very beginning and then after all the other events, that including Jesus' baptism and then the Jews questioning John, that I just went right to John speaking to the Jews. But I was thinking of where to put that section, and it's not clear. It seems as if he repeats himself. It begins, "John bore witness of him and cried, saying, This is he of whom I spoke. He that comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me." John 1:32 said, "And John bore record, saying, I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove." John 1:34, "And I saw and bore record that this is the Son of God." If we look at it the way I originally saw it, which I still agree, that at verse 19, it says, "This is the record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, 'Who are you?'" So it's exactly as it says. When Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to him to question him, saying, "Who are you? Are you the Messiah? Are you Christ? Are you the prophet? Are you Elijah?" That's where that begins, which means that these verses right before, it's as if he's just preaching to the audience. John bore witness of him, so it would seem as if maybe that would fit right when Jesus comes for baptism. John bore witness of him and cried, saying, "This, when he first saw him, is he of whom I spoke. He that comes after me is preferred before me." But I don't think so, because the next verse, it says, "Of his fullness we have received grace upon grace." Next verse, "For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ." Came by Jesus Christ, meaning that Jesus Christ is here. If he said grace and truth is come by Jesus Christ, it would be a perfect fit for when Jesus showed up for baptism. That's when John the Baptist would declare him and say, "This is the significance of this man." But because he's using past tense, it seems like it should be after. But it can't be before he's bearing record to the Pharisees, because that's when he pretty much says the same thing. 27, "He it is who coming after me is preferred before me," which is pretty much what he says in verse 15. "This is he of whom I spoke. He that comes after me is preferred before me." So it needs to be after Jesus came up for baptism, because he's saying he came. Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. But still, because of its location, probably should come before he's bearing witness to the Pharisees and priests and Levites. That's actually how it's explained. Priests and Levites. These are the only two instances that we see of John the Baptist here, when he's baptizing, up until he baptizes. But if it's after that, it's just Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, and then we come right back to John the Baptist where he's bearing witness. So I pretty much just figured right before he bears witness to the priests and Levites, instead of just jumping into the point where the priests and Levites are there and they're questioning him and he's bearing witness, we can just step back maybe perhaps 10 minutes in time as if he's preaching to a crowd, saying these verses. John bore witness of him and cried, saying, "This is he of whom I spoke." He's talking about Jesus. "He that comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me, and of his fullness have we received, and grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No man has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him." Then it's as if the priests and Levites have been listening, or they just arrived and they interrupt him and they start demanding questions about him, and the very next verse goes into that. And this is the record of John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" And his response is just, he confessed and denied not, but confessed, "I'm not the Christ." So whether it's immediate, he's saying these words and then he goes right into answering the priests and Levites, or if this could have been during the time that Jesus was in the wilderness, could have been a week before, it could have been 2 weeks before the priests and Levites come to John the Baptist. This could be what he's saying throughout that time, because he's talking about Jesus. He did come, he came, he's here. Grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. The only reason why this wouldn't work, of just putting it right here, just before this is the record of John, is that this could be more general, and it might fit better with what is at the very beginning, before the storyline of John the Baptist's birth and Jesus' birth, when it says, "There was a man sent from God, whose name was John," verse 6 in John 1. "The same came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lights every man that comes into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came to his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power." He's talking about Jesus still. "To them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe in his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." The reason why I don't think it fits in here, that's 6 to 13, is that, yes, it does speak about John at the beginning. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. So it could follow there, but it goes right back into speaking about Jesus again. He was not that light. He came to bear witness of the light, and then just speaks about the light. He's the light of the world. And then after that, after verse 13, it goes into verse 14, "And the Word was made flesh," talking about Jesus again. Unless I'm going to try and take verse 15 to 18 and stick it in just after verse 6, "There was a man sent from God whose name was John," and then maybe say John bore witness of him, on, and then go back to verse 7, "The same came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe." That might work, but I am not exactly comfortable breaking up this beautiful introduction that John gives. So the only other place is right there before he actually meets the priests and Levites. So unless I change my mind, that's just where I'm going to keep it.